we're going to do a quick little overview of Chapter 12. While you're here, make sure to click subscribe and then smash that like button and click the bell for notifications. Chapter 12 is about measuring the economy, and one of the first things we're going to talk about is gross domestic product, GDP. We talked about this earlier in the year, but now we're just going to go into it a little bit more in depth. So what is gross domestic product? GDP is the sum total of all the goods and services produced within a country during a given year. So ideally, we would just count the value of every single thing produced, every good and every service in the country during a year. Of course, literally counting everything produced in the country during a year would be nearly impossible. So they use statistical measures to do this, where they just estimate a certain percentage and then extrapolate or count upward from that. So there are some things that are not included in GDP, as we talked about earlier in the year. These are intermediate products, things that are made but then are used to make another thing. So we talked about the example of a car, how we count the final value of the car, but we don't count the final value of the car plus the value of all the parts that went into the car, because then we'd be double counting all those parts. We'd be counting their value as they were made, each individual part, but then we'd also count them again as part of the total value of the car. So instead, we just count the final product, the final goods and services. So that's an important part of GDP, is it's the total value of all the final goods and services produced in the economy during a given year. Also, something that's not included in GDP are secondhand sales. So if you have a yard sale, we don't count all of those products, even though they were sold, they had value, because that again would be double counting if we counted them when they were first made and produced, and then we counted them when you sold them again. We don't count things that are black market or underground sales. Those things don't get counted, not because they don't have any value, but because the government doesn't know about them by definition. They're underground or black market sales. So those are not counted in GDP. So some other terms to understand with GDP are current GDP compared to real GDP compared to base year GDP. So current GDP is pretty straightforward. It's just what is GDP this year. But of course, one of the things we want from the economy, one of the 7 goals of the economy, is economic growth. So we need to see, is GDP changing over time? We want to know, is the economy growing? But of course, with inflation, GDP should be growing simply because things are getting more expensive over time. So we want to make fair comparisons. So we need to be able to compare different years. And then we have to adjust GDP for inflation. And that's called real GDP. Real GDP is just GDP that has been adjusted for inflation so that we can make accurate comparisons from year to year. And in order to do those comparisons, we have a base year. The base year is sort of the beginning point that we're going to base everything on. So current GDP, the actual GDP right now, real GDP is GDP adjusted for inflation. Then, as we think about GDP, another important concept is what's called GDP per capita, or per capita GDP. Per capita just means per person, and this allows us to see what is our production per person. That's another way we can compare across time. As our population grows, GDP should automatically grow, but are people being more productive? So we want to see per person. We can also compare countries this way. So for example, China has a larger GDP than the United States. But if you look at GDP per person, America is far more productive than China. So which economy is bigger? Well, in terms of absolute numbers, China's got a bigger economy. In terms of per person production, the United States is bigger. So per capita GDP is another important way for comparing either across time or comparing different nations. Now, what does GDP tell us? It tells us about the production of the economy, but there are certain things GDP does not tell us. It does not tell us what an economy is producing, the output. So if GDP is growing, we do not know why it's growing. We do not know what it's growing into or anything like that. It's just a number of the total production value of goods and services within the country. GDP does not tell us about quality of life. So there's a bunch of research on basically once GDP exceeds a certain number per capita so that our immediate needs are met, we have housing, we have food, basic healthcare. After that, increases in GDP actually don't yield any increases in happiness within a society. So that old question, does money make you happy? Well, the answer seems to be if you're deeply in poverty, yes, money can make you happy. But once you have your needs met, money after that doesn't actually make you happy. So just because the United States has a higher GDP per capita than, say, France or Germany or something like that, doesn't mean that we're happier. Even though one of our goals for the economy is a growing economy, that does not actually yield happiness for individual people. And as we talked about earlier in the year, there are other things that are not included in GDP, non-market activities, things that are not sold. So, if a mom or a dad, makes dinner for the family, even though that has economic value, it is not counted. Remember, we count a chef in a restaurant, the value of their production, but not a person cooking dinner at home. Even though, it seems that they're both making a meal, one has an actual dollar value put to it, and one does not. And also, GDP doesn't include like the quality of goods. Just because we're making more stuff over time, even though the total value is going up, it doesn't mean necessarily that the products are worth more. People complain a lot today that things just aren't made the way they used to be made. So whether or not that's true, it isn't part of GDP. GDP only counts the actual dollar value of the final goods and services produced within a country during a given year. The next part of chapter 12 talks about gross national income. There are 5 different measures of national income that are discussed in the book, but I'm only going to focus on 2 of them, the 2 that are the most important. First is gross national product, and that is separate from gross domestic product. But gross national product is all the value of all the goods and services produced by the citizens of a country within a year. Now, gross domestic product is within the country, all the goods and services produced within a country, whether it's produced by citizens or not, but within the national borders. Gross national product is all the goods and services produced by the citizens of a country, regardless of where they are in the world. So an American who's living overseas, working in a factory somewhere else, or working in a job somewhere else, that person's product is part of GNP, but not GDP. GDP is discussed far more commonly, but GNP is another way. There are some countries where GNP is really important, such as the Philippines. The Philippines has a major emphasis on having citizens move overseas and get jobs in order to send money back to the Philippines. So there are countries where GNP is a very significant part of their economy. That's not true in the United States. It's not true in most countries. So we tend to focus far more on GDP. The other thing that we need to talk about of the measures of national income is discretionary income, disposable income. This is the money that is left over after you receive your pay and pay your taxes. This is the money that is actually available for spending in the economy. And this is what most people are going to care about. What money do they have available for spending? So there's personal income, that is the income before taxes, but disposable income is the money that they have available to spend on discretionary items or things that they're choosing to purchase. We don't choose to pay taxes, so that is not discretionary, but disposable income is what we have left after we pay taxes. So those are the 2 most important measures of national income, so GNP and disposable income. So make sure you understand those and know those, and make sure you understand the difference between GDP and GNP. That's really important. Now let's talk about chapter 12, section 2 on population growth. The first thing we need to know is, how do we measure population growth? Well, we do that with the census. You might know the Census Bureau of the United States takes a census or a poll accounting of all the people in the United States. We do this every 10 years. This is actually in the Constitution, that we count the population every 10 years for the purposes of representation. But over time, the census has grown in the number of things we ask and the types of things we ask, just so we can know more about our population. So one of the things the Census Bureau looks at is how many people are living in urban areas and how many people are living in rural areas. And that's changed significantly over time. You might know that even just 150 years ago, most Americans lived on farms. Clearly, that's not the case today. We've become more urbanized with the Industrial Revolution and then into the post-industrial revolution. So we want to count how many people are living on farms or rural areas, how many people are living in more urbanized areas. That is one of the important things that we're going to look at. Another thing we're going to look at is the center of population. Where are people living in our country? So we're going to count not just whether they're living in cities or outside of cities, but which parts of the country are growing and where is the center of the population. The book mentions that near the beginning of the country, the population center was more like east of Baltimore, Maryland. So people lived almost entirely on the East Coast, and not just the eastern coast states, but near the actual coast. But over time, there's a good map in our book that shows you the population has moved westward, and that has especially happened since the 1900s and especially since World War II. So the population of the United States is expanding westward. Another thing we want to consider is the age and distribution of ages of the population. So we want to count not only how many people are in the country and where they live, but what age are those people. This is extremely important for planning for the future of a country. So the textbook mentions things like the baby boom, 1946 to 1964. There was a huge increase in the birth rate following World War II. For most of human history, there's been a population pyramid shape. You probably learned about this in biology, but the largest group of people was young people, and then as you went older and older, you got fewer and fewer people. With industrialization, that started to change. Family size got smaller, and then when you get into the post-industrial age, that actually changes a lot even more. And people have fewer and fewer kids, and that changes the demographics of a country. And this is really important for planning for the future, because a lot of our systems are based on the idea that we have lots of young people who will be working and paying for the Social Security and the benefits of the fewer old people. But as we have fewer and fewer young people working and more people are living to old age because of better healthcare and things like that, that is dramatically changing our dependency structure in the country. So there's a dependency rate, which is discussed in the book, and in the book it even gives you the statistics on how that is changing. We have more and more people who are older and dependent on workers, and that's creating a problem for our society as we look forward to the future of Social Security. Social Security system is facing budget shortages, not surpluses. We've had a budget surplus in Social Security for many years, and that money has been taken out of the budget and spent on other things. Congress has used that to, instead of saving for people's retirements, Congress has spent that money. But those dollars that they've spent are now IOUs for people working in their future retirement, and that money is not going to be there, at least not all of it. So that creates a huge problem for the society and for planning for a future. So it's really important that we know the age distribution of people in our society and the dependency rate. So those are important things to know about, and the book has some good information on that. Now, obviously, one way to counter the effect of the dependency rate becoming an issue because of lots of people surviving to old age, which is a great thing, that's what we want, but it becomes a financial situation when we can't afford to pay for those Social Security things, those benefits. So one thing we can do is increase the fertility rate. But as I said, with industrialization and post-industrialization, fertility rates, or the number of children people have, is actually going down. So another thing we can measure is immigration, because if we don't have a lot of young people to replace workers, we can replace those workers through immigration. And America has always historically had a high number of immigrants coming in, so they've been very productive and beneficial to our economy. And currently, we still have a higher rate of immigration than emigration. Far more people are coming to America and being productive in our GDP than leaving our country and then being counted maybe in GNP. Just a refresher on some terms there. But immigration is also something that we want to count. So now when we get into section 3 of chapter 12, it's about poverty and the distribution of wealth in America. So first we need to know, what is poverty? Poverty is when you don't have enough income to meet your basic needs. So in the United States, we have a poverty threshold, a way where we count who is above or below the poverty level. And we use poverty guidelines for these. So the book has a chart that I'm going to show you in just a moment. So here is figure 12.5 on page 354, and it has the poverty guidelines for 2013. And what it shows you is that in 2013, if you were a single person, one person in the home, and you made less than $11,490 per year, you were considered in poverty. If there were two people in the home, it was $15,510, and you can go all the way up to 8 people. That would be $39,630. But it actually tells you there at the bottom that if you have more than 8 people in the household, you just add $4,020 for each additional person. So this guideline can get you an indication of whether a family is at or below or above the poverty level based on how much income they have. So this is what the government says a family of whatever size needs in order to meet its basic needs. Of course, this is 2013, so here's what it looks like now for 2023. Here are the poverty guidelines for 2023, and you can see the effect of inflation. Instead of the poverty guidelines for one person being 11,490, it's now 14,580. And then here is figure 12.6 showing the United States poverty rate across time. We can see as far back as 1960 and then all the way up to 2010. The red line is the number of people in poverty in millions of people, and the poverty rate is the blue line. As you can see, the poverty rate dropped during the 1960s until about 1970. Then it kind of remained roughly flat with some small increases over time. So the 1960s would be the Great Society program of Lyndon Johnson, who was president at the time. That did a pretty good job at reducing poverty. But since then, since the 1970s, we really haven't done much to reduce poverty in the United States. The red line shows that the actual number of people in poverty is going up over time. And that makes sense because our population is growing. So if the rate of people, the percentage of people in our population who are in poverty is staying roughly the same, then the number of people is going to be going up as the population goes up. And here is figure 12.7 showing the distribution of income in America. One of the things we talked about back in the free enterprise chapter is a disadvantage of freedom is it allows some people to be very successful and some people to be very unsuccessful. And that's kind of what we see here, the distribution of income showing that there are a lot of people with very low income. This Lorenz curve over on the right side, it shows the quintiles, or each 20%, the bottom 20%, all the way up to the top 20%. And you can see on the far left of this graph here, right here, the difference between the very, very poorest and the people at the 20th percentile. So this represents 20% of Americans. It's not a lot of difference. Then when you go from 20 to 40%, you get a fairly decent difference between them. 40 to 60%, you get a bigger difference. 60 to 80, a bigger difference, and then 80 to 100, an even bigger difference. As people get wealthier, the difference gets far greater. So there's a lot of people at the very low end, and they're very poor. And then there's still a significant number at high end who have a lot of money. And one of the big factors the book mentions for this is education. Education is very strongly correlated to income. Sometimes high school students want to know, when do I ever need to know this stuff? Well, the fact is, education strongly correlates to economic success. There's a reason we want you to learn about economics and learn about how the world works, because it makes a difference in your life. And this kind of shows the difference it can make. So on this chart here, it's showing the quintiles and the percentages at each level. So make sure you understand this information and understand the wealth distribution and what makes that difference in terms of the factors that decide how wealth is going to be distributed. The textbook actually goes through and talks about some of the factors that can affect the wealth distribution. Tax law changes. Tax laws can tax the rich more heavily or less heavily. Taxes can be used, such as the earned income tax credit we'll talk about in a little bit, can be used to help people in lower incomes. So there's that as a factor. The decline of unions. Unions used to be a major force in leveling the playing field between workers and owners. But with the decline of unions, the workers' power has dramatically been reduced. So income has been hurt for them. More service jobs. People are moving from an industrial type of occupation often towards service jobs, which tend to pay less. And that ties in a lot with advances in technology that people are, especially at the lower end, those with less education or less technical skills, less specialized ability, are being replaced by machines often, or they don't need to be as skilled to do jobs because computers can do a lot of the work for them, and if they're not as skilled, they're not going to get paid as much. So the book goes through, talks about some more of those. Some of them aren't necessarily bad or good. There are values judgments, such as changing family structure. Obviously, in the traditional American stereotypical family of, a single parent, the father working and the mother staying at home, they had one income. But then as more and more women went to work, suddenly most families were having two incomes, and that dramatically changed wealth distribution. But then in more recent decades, we've had a rise in single parent families, and single parent families statistically have far less wealth than two parent families. So those are issues that affect the wealth distribution. But one important thing to understand is that nobody is locked into a particular wealth strata or category. It is very easy and very common for people to move. They might be fairly wealthy, but then because of a divorce, drop in their wealth. Or they might start out pretty low, but then go to college or develop some trade or something like that, go to apprenticeship, get a good job, and then move up. So it is possible in America to move around within wealth quintiles. Finally, we're going to talk about anti-poverty programs. These are generally called welfare programs, programs designed to help the poor. The most common, stereotypical, traditional one is income assistance, food stamps, things like that. So that is one type of welfare system. So as it goes in, it talks about food stamps, it talks about Medicaid, which is paying for health care for people who are low income. There are social service programs, so you should read about those, and tax credits. The Earned Income Tax Credit is a tax credit that helps provide money to working families who are low income. So there's a big debate about this and the minimum wage. Minimum wage targets all people who are low income or low wage, most of which are young people who are still in school or developing skills. And so there's a debate about whether we should be increasing minimum wage when a huge chunk of that cost in paying for that is going to be benefiting, say, high school students or college students. But the Earned Income Tax Credit, on the other hand, is far more targeted toward low-income families. Something else they can do is what's called an enterprise zone, trying to encourage companies to move into areas that need economic assistance. So there you go. That was an overview of everything in chapter 12. Make sure you study what I talked about in this video. Go back, read the chapter, take notes on vocabulary, make sure you understand what's going on, and if you have any questions, make sure to ask.